The crate fell first. Reed Calloway did not drop it on purpose. His grip just gave out after 11 hours of loading, unloading, resealing, and arguing with a dock supervisor who kept changing the bay numbers. The crate hit the floor of outpost Drell with a sound like a gunshot, and every head in the docking bay turned. Nobody helped, that was fine. Reed crouched, checked the seal, found it intact, and dragged it the rest of the way by hand. Outpost Drell sat at the edge of dragon-controlled space, a mid-sized way station that smelled like machine oil and something vaguely reptilian that Reed had never been able to identify. He had been coming here for 4 years. He knew which food stalls were safe, which security guards took bribes, and which docking lanes flooded with coolant vapor if you parked too close to the wall. He did not know why the whole station felt different today. There were more uniforms, not human ones, dragon ceremonial escorts, long scale armor the color of dark copper, worn by soldiers who stood very still and watched everything. Reed counted 6 in the main bay alone. He kept his head down and moved his cargo. One of the dock workers, a squat fellow named Ben who always smelled like fried grain, appeared at Reed's elbow and said quietly that some noble dragon child was passing through. Succession business. The heir to the Varath line, apparently, big deal among the dragon clans. Reed said that was very interesting and asked Ben to help him lift the last crate. The job was done within the hour. Reed filed his departure paperwork, paid his bay fee, and started the walk back to his ship. He was thinking about the busted stabilizer on the portside thruster and whether he could get it welded here or would have to nurse it all the way back to Rel Station. He was not thinking about anything heroic. The young dragon was walking through the mid-bay corridor with 3 escorts. Reed noticed them because they were hard not to notice. A dragon child stood about chest height on a human, but moved with the stiff, careful dignity of someone who had been told their whole life that the way they walked meant something. The child's scales were pale gold, almost white at the edges. Young, maybe the dragon equivalent of 12 years old, though Reed was no expert. The escorts were spread too wide. Reed noticed that too, the way he noticed the crate seal and the coolant vapor, out of habit, not strategy. There was a gap between the left side guard and the wall that a person could slip through if they moved at the right moment. 3 people slipped through it. 2 more came from the right. All 5 wore plain gray clothes and moved fast, very fast, the kind of fast that came from practicing the same movement until it stopped feeling like movement and started feeling like falling. Reed was 12 feet away. He did not make a decision. That is the honest truth of it. There was no moment where he weighed the options or calculated the odds or thought about what came next. 1 second, he was walking toward his ship. The next second, he was not. He hit the nearest attacker with his shoulder and drove the man into the wall, which bought maybe half a second. Then he got in front of the dragon child and spread his arms wide like that meant something, like a human body was any kind of barrier against 5 trained killers. The first blade caught him across the back. He felt it as heat more than pain. The second was lower and worse. He kept his arms out. He did not move. The third blade grazed his left arm, and then the station security came in loud and fast from both ends of the corridor, and it was over. Reed did not remember going down. He just remembered the floor being colder than he expected, and the sound of running boots, and then, very close, very quiet, a voice that was not human saying something in dragon tongue that he was too foggy to catch. He turned his head. A pair of gold eyes was watching him from about 2 feet away. The dragon child was crouched beside him on the floor, and those eyes were enormous and completely still, the way a creature looks when it is trying to understand something it has never seen before. Reed thought he should probably say something reassuring. He did not get the chance. The lights went gray at the edges, and then everything was dark, and the last thing he heard was a second voice, older, female, commanding, issuing sharp instructions somewhere above him. He did not know where he was going. He did not know that no human had ever been taken there before. The stone was old. That was the first thing Reed noticed when he opened his eyes. Not the ceiling, which was vaulted and carved with script he could almost read, and not the pain in his back, which was present but duller than it should have been. The stone. The walls were the color of dark charcoal, worn smooth in the middle where hands or tails had brushed them for a very long time. Centuries, maybe, Maury. He was lying on a flat surface with no mattress, just a woven material that felt like compressed fiber. His shirt was gone. His wounds were bandaged in something thin and pale that smelled faintly of mineral oil. He tried to sit up. Something large shifted in the shadows at the far end of the room. "Do not move quickly," said a voice. It spoke in the common trade tongue, accented but precise. "The repair work on your back is recent." Reed moved slowly instead. He got upright and sat with his legs over the edge of the slab and looked at the dragon standing across from him. She was old. He could tell because her scales had gone from whatever their original color was to a deep iron gray at the edges, and because she held herself the way very old things hold themselves, without effort, without performance, like gravity was a suggestion she had long since stopped taking seriously. "Where am I?" Reed asked. "The Hall of Wardens," she said. "My name is Soren. I am the High Warden of the Dragon Guardian Order." She paused. "You are the first human to enter this hall in its 10,000 years of existence." Reed looked around at the carved walls and the high ceiling and the total absence of windows. "Right," he said. Soren watched him the way he imagined a scientist watched an unexpected result. Not hostile, just careful. "I have questions," she said. "So do I," said Reed. "Mine are mostly about my ship." Soren did not acknowledge this. "You saw the attack before our escort did. You reached the air before any trained guardian on station could respond. You interposed your body between 5 armed operatives and the most protected young dragon in this sector." She tilted her head. "Why?" Reed thought about it honestly. "I don't know, I just saw it happening." "That is not an answer." "It's the only one I have." Soren was quiet for a long moment. Behind her, from a doorway Reed hadn't noticed, a second dragon entered. This one was bigger, broader, with a scar that ran from his left jaw down across his chest. He carried himself like someone who had been in a lot of fights and had enjoyed most of them. "This is Warden Drav," said Soren. "He has watched the security recording 17 times. Drav looked at Reed with open curiosity. "You identified the threat pattern before the escort did," he said. "Explain how." Reed rubbed the back of his neck. "The left side guard left a gap by the wall, wide enough for a person. When I saw that, I started watching the exits." Drav made a low sound. "You have combat training." "Some years ago, nothing special." "No," said Drav, "but you had no rank to protect and no protocol to follow, so you moved." Something shifted in the doorway again. Reed looked past Drav and saw the dragon child standing there in the entrance. Pale gold scales, white at the edges. The same enormous, still eyes from the floor of the corridor. "Sovereign Varath," said Soren, with a tone that very clearly meant you were told to wait outside. The child ignored her and looked at Reed. "Do humans often do that?" Varath asked. "For strangers?" Reed did not know what to say to that. "I can't speak for most humans, I just know what I did." Varath considered this for a moment like it was a very complex equation, then stepped back out of the doorway without another word. Soren turned back to Reed. Her expression, as far as he could read it, had shifted slightly, still cold, but something was different. "The attack was not random," she said. "The operatives were hired. We know who hired them. That person is currently at the homeworld, attending the succession ceremony. Under current political conditions, we cannot move against him openly without proof delivered by a neutral witness." Reed looked at her. "You are a neutral witness," Soren said. "I'm a cargo hauler from the outer routes. You are the only person besides our order who can testify to what happened in that corridor." She said, "And under dragon law, you cannot leave until that testimony is formally given." Reed absorbed this. He thought about the stabilizer on his portside thruster and the delivery schedule he had already broken, and the dispatcher who was going to be very angry. "How long?" he asked. "Until the hearing is arranged," said Soren, "perhaps 2 weeks." Reed looked at the carved stone walls. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the old script he could almost read. "Can I at least send a message to my dispatcher?" Soren said nothing, but she did not say no. The guest chamber they gave Reed was not designed for humans. The sleeping surface was too long and too hard, the ceiling too high for the room to hold warmth, and the single light source was a bioluminescent panel set at a frequency apparently comfortable for dragon eyes, which meant everything looked faintly purple. Reed folded his jacket under his head and slept anyway. He had slept in worse places, once in a drainage channel on a moon that only had 6 hours of dark per rotation. The Guardians assigned Drav to watch him. This was presented as security. Reed suspected it was also curiosity. Drav showed up at the door of the guest chamber on the second morning with 2 portions of food, dragon rations, which Reed was not familiar with, and sat across from him while he ate and asked him questions that were casual in phrasing but not in intent. Where had he served? What routes did he run? How many years on the border? What did he notice when he walked into a new docking bay? Reed answered honestly. He had nothing to hide and nowhere to be. On the third day, Drav brought a physical challenge. Not formally, he just arrived carrying a heavy ring-shaped training weight and set it on the floor and looked at Reed without saying anything. The weight was, by Reed's estimate, about 3 times what any human would reasonably lift. Reed looked at the weight. He looked at Drav. He picked up the water container from the table, took a long drink, and then went back to the report he had been reading, a trade document Soren had allowed him to access, which happened to contain, buried in the shipping manifests, the movement logs of the vessels connected to the assassination plot. Drav watched him not touch the weight for about 4 minutes. Then he sat down and said, "What are you reading?" "Cargo records," said Reed. "The operatives who came through Drell, their transit fees were paid from a relay account that traces back to a charter company registered in the Veth system. The company was incorporated 11 months ago, 1 month before Varath's succession timeline was made public." Drav was very still. "That means whoever hired them knew about the succession before it was announced," Reed said, "which means they have someone inside the administrative offices of the Varath clan." Drav said slowly, "How did you find this?" "I read cargo records for a living," said Reed. "You learn to notice when the numbers don't add up." That night, someone tried to kill Reed. He heard them before he saw them, 2 people, entering through the ventilation access that ran behind the purple light panel. They were quiet, not quiet enough. Reed had been awake anyway, lying in the dark thinking about stabilizers and dispatcher anger, and the fact that someone had tried to kill a child in a busy docking bay, which meant they were either very bold or very panicked. The first one came through the panel low and fast. Reed was already moving. He had the emergency immobilizer from his boot, a small tool designed for locking cargo clamps remotely, which put out a tight electrical pulse at close range, and he pressed it against the first attacker's neck before the man had fully cleared the vent. The man went down hard. The second one was faster and had a blade out. Reed threw the empty water container at his face, which bought half a second, and then Drav came through the door like something geological, and the second attacker did not get back up. Drav stood in the middle of the room breathing in long, slow pulls. He looked at Reed. He looked at the first attacker on the floor. He looked at the immobilizer in Reed's hand. "You had that in your boot," said Drav. "Since the first attack," said Reed, "seemed like a good idea." Drav was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "You prepared." "I noticed the vent panel was installed wrong, screws on the outside instead of the inside. Someone replaced it recently." Reed set the immobilizer on the table. "Someone inside this station has a live connection to whoever hired those operatives. This attempt confirms it." Drav called it in. Soren arrived within minutes, assessed the 2 attackers, both still breathing, and then looked at Reed, standing in the middle of the room in bare feet, with a bruise forming on his left arm. Reed said, in dragon tongue, clearly and without hesitation, "The Insider is using a relay in the station's atmospheric maintenance system, same signal signature as the charter company account. I found it in the ventilation cycle logs an hour ago." Soren went completely still. Not because of what he said. Because of the language he said it in. She stared at him for a long moment. Reed held her gaze and did not explain himself. "You speak our language," she said finally, in dragon tongue. "Enough," he said. "Border roots, you pick things up." Soren looked at him, the way the stone walls looked, like something that had been here a long time and had learned to take nothing at face value. Then she said, in a voice that had changed just slightly, "I am going to give you a choice." The dragon homeworld had no name in the common tongue. The dragons called it something that translated roughly as the first stone, and from orbit it looked like a world that had decided, very early on, that it did not need to impress anyone. Dark green landmasses, grey-blue oceans, clouds that moved in slow, organized spirals. Old, settled, completely unbothered. Reed watched it through the viewport of the Guardian warship and kept his face neutral. The crew of the ship had not said a single word to him since departure. Not rudely, they simply had no frame of reference for what he was or why he was aboard. He heard two of them talking in the lower corridor, quiet enough that they probably thought he couldn't follow it. One asked the other what a human smelled like up close. The other said, like metal and grain, and something they couldn't identify. Reed thought that was probably fair. Drav found him at the viewport and stood beside him in a way that, over the past few days, had started to feel less like guarding and more like company. "The ceremony ends in 2 days," Drav said. "Delegate Oran formally endorses the rival heir on the final day. Once that happens, the endorsement carries political protection. We cannot move against him after." "So we have 1 day," Reed said. "We have one problem before that," said Drav. "The Guardians cannot interrupt the High Council session without proof, not accusation, proof, delivered by a neutral witness." He paused. "Delivered in person, on the council floor." Reed nodded slowly. He had understood this since Soren explained the choice back at the Hall of Wardens. He had said yes then. He was not going to say something different now just because the homeworld was getting larger in the viewport. "Have you been in front of a governing body before?" Drav asked. "Port Authority Tribunal on Rel Station, 2 years ago, dispute about impound fees." Drav did not ask how that went. The council chamber was underground. This was apparently traditional. The oldest decisions were made in stone, close to the earth, where the weight of the world could remind everyone in the room that they were temporary. The ceiling was 30 feet high and carved with the names of every High Warden going back to the founding of the Order. Reed walked in behind Drav and Soren and tried not to look like he was counting the exits. There were 16 council members on the raised floor. Every seat was filled. The chamber held another 40 observers in tiered galleries along the walls, diplomats, clan representatives, ceremonial witnesses. Every pair of eyes in the room found Reed within about 4 seconds of his entry. He kept walking. Delegate Oran sat in the third seat from the left. Reed identified him from the briefing files. Older dragon, dark green scales, a pattern of silver markings along the jaw that indicated senior clan rank. Oran looked at Reed with the specific expression of someone who had expected a problem and was now recalculating how large it was. The council head, a broad, grey dragon named Warden Presiding Kel, spoke first. "This session was called on emergency provision by High Warden Soren. A neutral witness is present. The witness will speak." Reed stood in the center of the floor. The stone was polished smooth. His boots made no sound. He spoke in dragon tongue. He kept it simple. He laid out the timeline from the moment he saw the gap in the escort formation to the moment he hit the ground. He named the 2 dead attackers by the identification pulled from their gear. He described the relay account and the charter company and the atmospheric maintenance signal. He placed the immobilizer on the floor in front of him, his equipment logged to his personal ID, which the records showed had been used the night of the second attempt on his life, and he left it there as physical evidence. Then he looked at Oran and said that he had spent 6 years on border routes, and in that time he had met many people who assumed that because he was small and because he moved cargo for a living, he was not paying attention. The chamber was silent. Oran said, in a voice that had stayed carefully controlled, that the testimony of a human cargo worker was not grounds for any action against a delegate of senior clan rank, and that the physical evidence was circumstantial, and that this entire proceeding was an embarrassment to the order. Varath walked in from the side entrance. The child moved to the center of the floor and stood beside Reed, which by Dragon Clan protocol meant something very specific. It meant the air was claiming the ground. It meant the air was choosing whose account to stand with. Varath looked at Oran. Then, in a voice that was young but very steady, the air confirmed every word Reed had said, and added one more thing. 2 of the 5 attackers from the docking corridor had survived custody. Both had, under questioning, identified their point of contact as a relay handler registered to Oran's private staff. Oran was removed from the chamber within the hour. The room did not cheer. It did not make any dramatic sound at all. It simply moved, guards, officials, administrators, in the quiet, organized way of a system correcting an error. Kel looked down from the raised floor at Reed. "Who is this human?" he asked Soren. Soren was quiet for just a moment. "I am still deciding," she said. 3 days after Oran's removal, the homeworld was still buzzing. Not loudly, dragons did not buzz loudly, but in the way of large, old civilizations, in the careful, repeated conversations of officials in long corridors, in the language of formal communiques sent between clan seats, in the way every member of the Guardian Order that Reed passed in the hall looked at him for exactly 1 second longer than necessary before looking away. Word had spread. A human cargo hauler had walked into the High Council chamber and laid out a conspiracy in dragon tongue. Reed spent most of those 3 days trying to get his ship released from impound. He had been transferred to a guest residence on the homeworld, nicer than the stone chamber at the Hall of Wardens, with a window and a sleeping surface that was almost the right size. Drav came by each morning, which Reed had stopped questioning. The big guardian brought food and sat across from Reed and talked, and at some point it had stopped feeling like surveillance and started feeling like the kind of friendship that neither party had intended, but neither was willing to name yet. On the 4th day, Soren arrived. She did not sit. She stood in the center of the room and looked at Reed the way she had looked at him in the Hall of Wardens, the scientist, and the unexpected result. Except now there was something else underneath it that Reed could not quite identify. "Oran's network has been dismantled," she said. 17 individuals across 4 systems. The succession is secured. Varath will be formally confirmed tomorrow. Reed said that was good news. "There is another matter," said Soren. She explained it without preamble, which Reed appreciated. The Dragon Guardians, 10,000 years old, never in their history expanded to non-dragon membership, were debating, not about whether Reed was capable, not even entirely about whether he was trustworthy, but about what it meant, about what it changed, about whether one human doing one thing, however unexpected, was enough reason to alter a tradition that had stood since before most current species had developed writing. Reed listened and said nothing. "Drav has argued for you," said Soren. "He says the Order's purpose has never been about species. It has been about the willingness to stand between the innocent and the blade." "He's not wrong," said Reed. "No," said Soren, "he is not." She paused. "I have argued against. Tradition is not merely sentiment, it is structure. Structure is why this order has lasted." Reed nodded. He did not argue. "Varath settled it this morning," Soren continued. He had not expected that. He kept his face steady, but something shifted behind his eyes. The heir made a formal declaration before the full assembly of wardens, said Soren. Under Dragon Clan law, when a member of a protected bloodline is bodily shielded by another being, not a guardian, not bound by duty, not acting on order, that creates a life debt. The debt belongs to the bloodline. And under guardian law, a life debt incurred by an heir because a guardian detail failed to prevent the threat must be honored by the order that failed. Reid worked through this slowly. The heir is saying the guardians owe me a debt, he said. The heir is saying the order failed to protect him and that you filled the gap the order left. Under the law, we cannot dishonor that claim. Soren looked at him evenly. We cannot refuse. Reid was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the homeworld was grey-green and slow, the clouds moving in their patient spirals above a world that had been making decisions like this one for a very long time. "What is the position?" he asked. "Adjunct Guardian," said Soren, "a role not filled in 300 years, previously held only by allied dragon kin who served in support capacity to the Order. You would not hold full warden rank. You would not command guardian units, but you would carry the badge of the Order, operate under its authority, and be bound by its code." She paused. "You would be the first non-dragon in the history of the Guardians." Reid looked at the window for a while. He thought about his ship, still in impound, the stabilizer still broken. He thought about his dispatcher, who had sent him 14 increasingly angry messages over the past week. He thought about the drainage channel on the 6-hour rotation moon and the cold floor of the docking corridor and the pair of gold eyes watching him from 2 feet away while everything went dark. He thought about the fact that somewhere in 3 or 4 other star systems, the news of what happened in that High Council chamber was being read by people who had always known humans existed and had never once wondered what they were made of. "Does it pay better than cargo hauling?" he asked. Soren did not understand human humor. This was becoming clear. She answered him completely seriously, explaining that Guardian compensation was considered among the highest in the known galaxy and included housing, medical access, and travel provisions. Reid nodded. "I'll need to send a message to my dispatcher," he said. Soren waited. "Tell me what I have to sign," said Reid. 6 months later, Reid's back still ached in cold rooms. He had been told by the dragon biomedics that the tissue repair was complete, that by any measurable standard he was fully healed, and that any lingering sensation was likely psychological. Reid did not argue with this. He simply noted that the biomedics had never been stabbed and moved on. The training was not what he had expected. He had expected to fail at things, and he did. He could not match a guardian in strength, speed, or reach. He could not fly, breathe combustible gas, or survive the pressure levels they trained in as a baseline. The first week of physical drills had made this very clear in ways that required no discussion. What he had not expected was the way they watched him during the things he was good at. Threat assessment, pattern recognition, reading a room full of strangers in under a minute, moving through a crowd without being tracked, knowing without data or calculation that something was wrong before anything visible had happened. These were not dramatic skills. They did not look impressive, but the Guardians watched him do them with the focused attention of people who had not seen these things done this way before. One morning, a senior warden named Fen pulled Drav aside after a joint assessment drill and asked him, not quietly enough, how the human always knew which direction trouble would come from. Drav said he had asked Reid the same question. He said he learned it by delivering cargo to places that didn't want to pay him, Drav said. He said you develop a sense for it or you don't get paid. Fen looked at Reid, who was on the other side of the training floor writing notes on a piece of physical paper because he said writing by hand helped him remember things. That is the most unglamorous origin of a tactical skill I have ever heard, said Fen. Yes, said Drav, and he sounded very fond of this fact. Varath visited every 2 weeks without fail. The child was different than Reid had expected a noble heir to be, less interested in formality than in questions. Varath asked Reid about human history, human conflict, human food, human architecture, human humor, and once, very seriously, what the human concept of friendship meant, because the dragon equivalent had 17 distinct categories, and the human version seemed, from what Varath could determine, to cover all 17 with just one word. Reed thought about it and said that was probably accurate and that humans found it efficient. Varath wrote this down. The Elder Wardens noted, in their careful and formal way, that the heir was more curious and less imperious than any Varath heir in the past 4 generations. They did not publicly connect this to anything, but they noticed. The galaxy, meanwhile, was having a quieter version of the conversation the Guardians were having. 3 species sent formal diplomatic inquiries to the Order within the first 2 months, asking whether Reed's induction represented a policy change. The Order replied that each situation was evaluated individually and that no general policy change had been enacted. The inquiries kept coming. One evening, Drav found Reed standing at the outer wall of the Guardian residence on the homeworld, looking at the sky. Dark green clouds, very high up, catching the last of the light. Drav stood beside him, and after a while asked the question he had been carrying for 6 months. "Were you afraid in the corridor at Drell?" Reed did not answer right away. "Yes," he said, "I was terrified." "But you moved." "Yes." Drav turned to look at him. "Why?" Reed was quiet for a long moment. The clouds moved, the light changed. "I don't know how to explain it," he said. "I just couldn't be the person who stood there and watched it happen." Drav turned this over in the way he turned most things over, slowly, thoroughly, with the patience of a creature that had lived several centuries and had learned that fast conclusions were usually wrong. "In old dragon tongue," he said, "we have a phrase. It is used rarely. It describes a quality we once thought was unique to dragonkind." He paused. "It translates, roughly, as the instinct that makes a species worth knowing." Reed said nothing. "We did not think humans had it," Drav said. "We were not looking." 6 months after that, Reed stood at his post at the entrance to Varath's formal residence. He wore Guardian armor, fitted to human proportions, by a craftsman who had never made a set that small and had apparently found the challenge interesting. He carried the adjunct badge of the Order on his left chest. His boots were the same ones from the docking corridor at Drell. He had not replaced them. A diplomatic party arrived for a formal visit. Among them was a delegate from a minor species, small, grey, cautious, arriving at the homeworld for the first time. The delegate's aide kept close and whispered translation and context into the delegate's ear. The delegate stopped in front of Reed, looked at him, looked at the badge, looked at the armor. Whispered to the aide, "What species is the guard?" The aide answered quietly, "Human." The delegate looked uncertain, said in a low voice that they were not aware humans served in the Guardian Order. The aide glanced at Reed, then back at the delegate. "They do now," the aide said. Reed watched them pass through the gate. He did not move from his post. The sky above the homeworld was doing the thing it did in the late afternoon, the clouds catching color from 2 directions at once, green and gold, slow and enormous, and completely unbothered. His back ached slightly in the cold. He did not mind. He had never learned how to stand there and watch. He did not intend to start now.